everyone! Welcome to our video presentation on Canada's language policies. Today, we'll explore the historical background, current policies, and the challenges they face. Join us as we take a closer look at how language plays a vital role in Canada's diverse society.
Canada's language policy is a framework of laws and measures designed to manage the country's linguistic diversity, particularly concerning English, French, and Indigenous languages. Historically, this policy has aimed to balance the relationships among these language communities, though not always with equitable outcomes. The enactment of Official Language Act in 1969 was a pivotal moment, declaring English and French as the official languages of the federal administration and mandating bilingual services. Additionally, the policy acknowledges the importance of preserving Indigenous languages, recognizing their cultural significance and the need for revitalization efforts. Overall, Canada's language policy reflects its commitment to accommodating linguistic diversity and promoting inclusivity within its multicultural society.
Now, let's dive into the key questions that will guide our discussion on Canada's language policies. First, what is the historical context of language policies in Canada? Understanding the past helps us see how these policies have evolved over time. Next, what are the current language policies in Canada? We'll examine the official languages, laws, and regulations that shape communication in the country today. And finally, what challenges or issues are language policies in Canada facing? Despite progress, there are still debates and concerns surrounding these policies. With these questions in mind, let's explore Canada's language policies in more detail.
Now let us move on to historical context. First is linguistic and political background. So Canada's language policy is said to be unique due to its nature of having an official bilingualism, and the Official Act of 1969 mandates that the official language of the country will be French and English, and this bilingual model supports the reform in public institutions, education, and government services. Second is colonial or post-independence language development. So Indigenous languages suffered severely under colonization and assimilationist policies, which residential schools are operational from 1870s to 1990s, which actively punished the use of Indigenous languages, resulting in intergenerational language loss. And in 1969, the Government of Canada states in White Paper and also declared in effect that the need for paternalistic protection had passed, and that it was time for Aboriginal people, which is a term used for a specific group of people who inhabited the country even before the First Nation, that to trade their special status for common rights of citizenship as individual Canadians. This is a plan developed to reform the Indian Act, which previously governed the administration of reserved lands and as the status of Indigenous peoples, with the goal of empowering Indigenous communities and transitioning away from the federal government's role as a trustee for Indigenous lands and resources. And in 2008, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or TRC, highlighted language loss as a form of cultural genocide, and in response to that, they created the Indigenous Languages Act in 2019, which promotes the use of Indigenous language, including the sign languages, that reclaim, revitalize, maintain, and strengthen the Indigenous languages. Lastly is the Bill 101. This states that the province of Quebec gained independence in achieving French as its sole official language in response to the perceived threat of English dominance. Now let us move on to the language policy in Canada. We all know that French and English is their official languages. as stated earlier. But this duality, enshrined in the Canadian Institution in 1982, guarantees the principle of equality between French and English. This means that Canadians have the right to use both languages in federal courts and expect federal services in both languages. Now, moving on, let's discuss the linguistic intervention. So this is the way the language change and our shape rather. So first is informal intervention. It happens through everyday language contact. So Pidgin, simplified languages formed from necessity, and Creoles, their more developed descendants, are prime examples. There is also diglossia, where two languages coexist with distinct roles, and linguistic assimilation, where one language dominates. These are all common outcomes of informal intervention. Now, let's move on to formal intervention, since language change isn't always organic. So it involves governments actively shaping language use. So Quebec's Office Québécois de la langue française, for example, is striving for language parity, promoting French within the province. These are just two sides of a complex issue. The forces shaping their language are multifaceted, which is a mix of natural evolution and deliberate policy. However, of course, there is always a con. The implementation of language policy varies drastically across Canada, reflecting the needs for diverse aspiration of its provinces. For example, in Quebec, with majority of French population, they have adopted a unique approach through the Charter of French Language. This legislation aims to safeguard the French language and culture within the province, leading to its official status as the language of public administration, education, and commerce. And to comply with all of those needs and aspiration, there is a principle when it comes to the language policy in Canada. Central to this debate are the principles of personality and territoriality. The principle of personality emphasizes that individual language choice, often applied at the federal level. It allows the Canadian citizens to access services in the language of their choice. Conversely, the principle of territoriality aims to strengthen the language within a specific territory only, as seen in Quebec. It promotes the dominant language within the region, ensuring its vitality and influence. These principles are not mutually exclusive but rather coexisting, influencing various aspects of Canadian life. The federal government has a responsibility to ensure the development of language infrastructure and comply with the Official Languages Act. This includes funding programs like Official Languages Support Programs, or OLSP, which aim to promote linguistic duality and support minority language communities across the country. Now, when it comes to active offer principle and complaint mechanism, they are used to enrich the Canadian language. The active offer principle refers to the adaptation of the languages in various provinces, encouraging the public institutions to welcome citizens in both official languages, while there is also complaint mechanism in place, like the Office of the Commissioner of Official Languages. This is to ensure the compliance with the Official Languages Act and address any concerns about linguistic discrimination.
So, here are the challenges and issues that relates to Canada's linguistics. The challenges facing Indigenous language in Canada can be divided into three key areas. First, there are implementation gaps. Unlike English and French, Indigenous language lack constitutional recognition and strong legal protection. Second is the social attitudes and discrimination, which suppress Indigenous language, particularly through policies of assimilation. One of the most damaging examples is the residential school system, where Indigenous children were forbidden to speak their native language and often punished for doing so. This has led to intergenerational language loss. And lastly, there are access and equity issues. Many Indigenous children today do not have adequate opportunities to learn their ancestral language in school, making it difficult to pass them on the future generations. And for future directions, first we have is the better allocation of fundings, which can truly help in strengthening the Indigenous language in Canada, which relates to our second one that they can use in strengthening the legislation, such as the one existing in 2019 or the Indigenous Languages Act, which strengthens the holds of Indigenous culture of the country. And lastly is the better cultural understanding that promotes cultural awareness and linguistic diversity to combat discrimination. In conclusion, Canada's language policy is designed to manage its diverse linguistic landscape by officially recognizing English, French, and Indigenous languages. The 1969 Official Language Act established bilingualism at the federal level, while ongoing initiatives focus on revitalization of Indigenous languages, which are central to Canada's history and identity. Policy reflects Canada's colonial past and current commitment to inclusivity and cultural preservation. The balance between individual language rights and territorial language protection, supported by the key legislation such as Official Languages Act and the Quebec's Charter, created a multifaceted approach to linguistic equality. Despite challenges, Canada's continued efforts to protect and promote all languages, including Indigenous ones, demonstrate its dedication to foster a more inclusive and respectful society.
That concludes our presentation on Canada's language policies. We hope you gained valuable insights into how language shapes nations' identity and governance. Thank you for your time and attention.